we will extend to the opponents of force the material resources of this nation.
And yet Roosevelt had made an unequivocal promise of help. It should have been a warning. Presidential words, both private and public, could not be taken at face value. By late June 1940, Churchill was isolated. Hitler was master of Europe. Roosevelt's promises of help had come to nothing. But the shock of Hitler's conquests had forced many Americans into a rethink. Opinion polls showed that the number willing to help Britain, even if it meant the United States being dragged into the war, jumped from 30 to 60%. And Roosevelt could see that Churchill and the British intended to fight on, come what may. In these changed circumstances, Churchill asked once again for the loan of America's World War I destroyers.
31st of July. Mr. President, with great respect, I must tell you that in the long history of the world, this is a thing to do now.
This time, Roosevelt, on much safer political ground, said yes. But to keep the United States Congress happy, he insisted on a legal agreement under which Britain, in return for the destroyers, gave America 99-year leases on military bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. Churchill did not mind the Americans having the bases, but felt humiliated that it should be made to appear a trade. In a transatlantic phone call with the American Attorney General, Robert Jackson, he remarked,
"Empires just don't bargain."
Jackson replied,
"Republics do."
It was the first tiny dent in Churchill's beloved empire. But the value in morale was priceless. Announcing the destroyer deal to the House of Commons, he was jubilant.
The 20th of August. The PM ended his speech by comparing Anglo-American cooperation, will it one day be unity, to the Missouri River and saying, "Let it roll on." I drove back with him in the car and he sang Old Man River, out of tune, the whole way back to Downing Street.
The autumn of 1940 hardened Roosevelt's view that Churchill was worth backing. The Royal Air Force beat off the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Hitler's invasion plans were stalled. Those close to Churchill, like the War Secretary Anthony Eden and his private secretary John Colville, could see him begin to relax.
Tuesday, October the 8th, 1940. The PM, dressed in his blue siren suit, dined with Eden in his new dining room at number 10. He was in great form and amused Eden and me very much by his conversation with Nelson, the black cat, whom he chided for being afraid of the guns and unworthy of the name he bore. "Try and remember," he said to Nelson reprovingly, "what those boys in the RAF are doing."
So far, all Churchill had been able to offer Roosevelt was grim warnings. But now, with Hitler for the moment thwarted, he could show Roosevelt too his lighter side.
I cannot feel that the invasion danger is past. The gent has taken off his clothes and put on his bathing suit, but the water is getting colder and there is an autumn nip in the air.
But the brutal truth was that Churchill needed Roosevelt more than ever. By late 1940, the fight against Hitler was bankrupting Britain. Churchill pleaded for massive American aid. Within his long cable to Roosevelt was one short, stark sentence.
7th of December. The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies.
In fact, Roosevelt had already decided to help. He'd just been re-elected President of the United States for an unprecedented third term, having promised Americans their country was not going to war. Yet he believed that Hitler could not be stopped without American help. He now came up with a way of achieving these contradictory aims. He would finance and equip the British to do the fighting and keep the Nazis away from the United States. On December the 29th, 1940, Roosevelt broadcast his big idea to Americans.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain.
Roosevelt's speech sent shockwaves throughout Europe's capitals. In Berlin, the Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, sensed the sea change.
29th of December 1940. The USA is sliding increasingly into war psychosis. But will Roosevelt actually declare war?
In London, this was precisely the question that Churchill was now asking himself. And he began to harbour an illusion that would bring both disappointment and great distress.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United
Roosevelt's
States.
first act after his inauguration in January 1941 was to introduce the legislation for what became known as Lend-Lease aid. Churchill saw it as the first step on an inevitable and intentional road to war.
The PM is delighted by the new American bill, which contains wide powers for the President in every sphere of assistance to us. He says this is tantamount to a declaration of war by the United States.
There were further private signs of Roosevelt's apparent intentions. At this very moment, Harry Hopkins, the President's closest political associate, arrived in Britain and gave Churchill an unequivocal assurance.
The President has sent me here to tell you that at all costs and by all means he will carry you through, no matter what happens to him. There is nothing that he will not do so far as he has human power.
Churchill knew that under the United States Constitution, the President could only ask for a declaration of war. Congress had to approve it. But while a vocal minority of Americans wanted to have nothing to do with Europe's war, the majority wished to help. Churchill told John Colville,
The important element is the boldness of the President. He will lead opinion and not follow it. He does not want war, but he will not shrink from war.
Even more encouragement came from a second American visitor to London, Wendell Willkie, the Republican candidate defeated in the presidential election. Willkie gave Churchill a handwritten message from Roosevelt.
I think this verse applies to your people as it does to us. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union strong and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate.
To Churchill, the obvious meaning was that the President was preparing to fight side by side with him. But when Willkie returned to Washington, the first question Roosevelt asked him about Churchill was,
Is he a drunk?
10 months on, the private suspicions remained, and Roosevelt was making different noises to different people. What Churchill did not yet understand was that nothing Roosevelt said could be taken